3, 2, 1. Hey, Buzzheads. Welcome to
BuzzHead Radio.
BuzzHead Radio. So we got the intro music is playing. Here we are again. BuzzHead Radio. Okay, hey everybody. Welcome to another episode of BuzzHead Radio.
Oh, it's a special episode for everybody.
It is a special episode. Don't forget, if you guys want to give us a holler, it's 580-541-3805 is the official BuzzHead hotline, or you can email us at buzz@buzzheadmedia.com. So, yeah, like you said, tonight is going to be a special episode. It is in conjunction with several people, but let's get a quick announcement out of the way. If you guys need your car worked on, if you have any auto body problems, don't forget to give Ken Hunnell and the clan over at Enid Auto Body a shout.
Shout to... Oh, no, don't shout to the devil. That's a song. Yeah, they got a really cool thing online. You can go to enidautobody.com and click on the estimate link. You just take pictures of your car, walk around, get several good pictures of the damaged area, send it to them. They'll get on the phone with you, get you all taken care of. It's really cool, and you know what? You can go in there and there's a big window. So you can see all the cars that they're working on, and you can see your car being worked on. You go in there whenever you want. They'll take you back in there and show you what's going on. Pretty cool. Or you can call them at 580-234-5492. I should have that number memorized by now, but I don't.
One of these days you will. But anyway, the reason we even bring that up is because Enid Auto Body is the official sponsor of the BuzzHead Radio Podcast. So we appreciate them helping us keep this podcast on the air. So tonight, what happened was Frank Baker, who used to be an old radio guy, probably the most used MC in Enid, Oklahoma. He's been doing some stuff for me. He does a weekly video on Enid Buzz called The Weekend Party Binge. And we got to talking about podcasts and crime podcasts. And then he got to talking to Cindy Allen at the Enid News Eagle about podcasts and crime podcasts. And I told him that Todd and I were doing an Enid-centric podcast called BuzzHead Radio these days. And so those two got together and they thought, well, what if we look back in the archives of the Enid News and Eagle of some of the old murders and crime. And then we do maybe a random podcast, like maybe once a month, once a quarter, about one of those stories. Well, the first one that they came up with was one that attorney Stephen Jones was the attorney on. And so we thought, well, let's get a hold of Stephen Jones and see if he will do an interview and be on the podcast. Well, he agreed to it. And those two hang out with April Danahy, who actually was a reporter on the story when it happened.
Back in early 80s.
I don't think I wrote down the year.
I think it was early 80s.
Yeah, it'll be, we'll have it. They'll talk about it more. So what happened was just, it was recorded in Stephen Jones' office. Shout out to Blazer Pro, Justin Blazer. Justin went, Todd was working. I was out of town. So Justin went and set up the recording equipment and the cameras. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, there is also a video version at youtube.com/Enid Buzz. So it's all on video. If you're watching this on video on YouTube, you can just listen to the audio version on pretty much any podcasting app. And the podcast is called BuzzHead Radio.
Which you should be listening to anyway.
You should be listening to it because we talk about Enid every week, kind of the events. This week, we're not really going to talk about much because we're going to leave the interview to be most of the episode this week. So basically what they all got together. Justin Blazer recorded everything.
Thank you, Justin.
Frank Baker and April and Cindy Allen all asked questions, and so you guys will get to hear the podcast coming up. So real quick, the story, 42-year-old
Slow down, son.
Enid woman charged with first-degree murder. Stephen Jones was hired to be her, and he explains why he was hired in the interview to be her attorney. Instead of being charged with murder, she was charged with a lesser degree of first-degree manslaughter. Caton, her name was Karen Sue Caton, and she was an Enid home builder and the wife of Enid lumberyard dealer, which was Caton Lumber, and she was accused of hiring Dennis Olen Coggin for $300 to beat up and castrate Enid realtor Jack Krichmar, who owed her $7,000. Unfortunately, during the attack, Krichmar was fatally stabbed and died in the attack, and so that's what caused this whole murder case.
Yeah, so it was very prominent. It was a big deal around here, and that it was the end of the lumberyard. And their business has been around a long time. We used to buy material there all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it was not only, and it was so big that they didn't even try it in Garfield County. They had to move it out of the county because of the notoriety of it. So, but a lot of the details will be in this upcoming interview. So we're just going to kind of turn it over to those guys. And again, we want to thank Cindy Allen with the Enid News Eagle. We want to thank April Danahy. And we want to thank Frank Baker and Blazer Pro for bringing this next interview. So you guys listen up.
Well, welcome to the world of Enid Buzz. I'm Frank Baker, and we have with us distinguished barrister, legendary attorney, and a good friend. I like the heck out of this guy, Stephen Jones, who today will be chatting about the Karen Sue Caton case. And since my news and legal expertise is about like that, we have a couple of people who've been reporters for a long time. Now they've gone on to other things. Cindy Allen from Cub Reporter Once Upon a Time in Shawnee to the publisher of the Enid News and Eagle. And April Danahy, who was a news director, an award-winning news director in radio for a number of years, now the Senior VP for Human Resources and Marketing at Security National Bank. Did I get that right?
Corporate communications, same
okay.
thing.
So these gals will be asking the bulk of the questions. And I think first off, Cindy, what we talked about, just if you're just jumping in on this on Enid Buzz or the News and Eagle, they may be using it as well. Let's talk about the case before we start chatting with Brother Stephen about everything that transpired in a legendary case from the 80s.
That's right. Well, these are the facts of the crime. All right. So on June 8th, 1984, Enid realtor Jack Krichmar, 38, was stabbed multiple times in the back and neck and died from his wounds. Krichmar was an agent for Frontier Realty, and he'd made arrangements to show a house that day to someone who had called earlier to make an appointment. While at the house, he was attacked and stabbed, then tried to drive himself to the hospital. He lost consciousness and died about an hour later. On June 11th, 1984, police arrested two suspects in the stabbing death, Dennis Olen Coggin, 32, an oil field worker from Nokomis, and Karen Sue Caton, 41, of Enid, was arrested in the crime. Both were charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors alleged Caton, an Enid home builder and wife of an Enid lumber yard dealer, hired Coggin to beat up and castrate Enid realtor Jack Krichmar, who she said owed her $7,000. She also allegedly was having an affair with Krichmar and was upset that he wouldn't leave his wife. At Caton's trial, which was moved to Kay County, she was found guilty of the lesser charge of first-degree manslaughter for her part in the slaying, and she was sentenced to a 4-year term. At his trial, which was moved to Oklahoma City, Coggin was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
My goodness. And it was one of those cases, April, I mean, you covered it, but this was one of those things in terms of just generating publicity and coverage. It was immense.
It was, well, I had just gotten out of college, and so it was my first big case that I had gone to over at the Garfield County Courthouse. When I became familiar with the crime, I was doing my beat at the police department, looking over the reports, and walked out to find yellow tape around a van. Later to find out that it was the victim's van. So that's the first time I became acquainted with the case. The second time I became acquainted with the case was when I arrived for the, not sentencing, but the first time that Dennis Coggin appeared in the courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
And he came in, and it was about 3 days later, maybe 4, and he was in orange coveralls, and he looked very disheveled, hair everywhere, very frightening, as what people might think somebody who had committed a heinous crime such as this.
Allegedly at that point.
Allegedly came in, and he stood there. He was huge. He was a big man. And by the time he had the preliminary hearing for Mr. Coggin, he was very much cleaned up and looked like a beach boy. I mean, he looked very less frightening, and his court-appointed attorney was representing him, and they had the preliminary hearing, which was held separately, I believe, from Karen Sue Caton. The first time I saw Miss Caton in the courtroom, she was accompanied by her attorney, Mr. Jones here, and then so it ensued, and you can tell the difference between, I want to say, a seasoned attorney and an attorney who wasn't quite maybe ready for such a huge case, because certainly Mr. Jones was ready, and some of the, I don't want to call them theatrics, but they were point getters during the preliminary hearing.
Not Stephen.
Well, no, they were very interesting to a very young adult who was an Enidite, who had never really been up against or to see any kind of violent crime in her life, really, and to hear the horrific nature of these crimes. So that's how I first came acquainted with the case of Dennis Coggin and Karen Sue Caton and the victim.
All right, so Stephen, we bring you in. How did you end up involved in representing Karen Sue Caton in this, like I say, case that just generated amazing publicity?
I had represented Mrs. Caton earlier in some civil matters, and one of the matters had to do with this debt that Jack Krichmar owed Mrs. Caton, which, as I recall, was $12,000, but in any event, it was less than $20,000. And Mr. Krichmar had not paid the debt, and the police arrested Mrs. Caton, and I happened to be on vacation, and I remember coming home and opening the back door of my house, and the telephone was ringing, and I rushed to answer it, and it was Mac Caton, Sue's husband, telling me that Sue had been arrested for murder and wanted me to represent her. So there's a couple of things interesting and almost unprecedented about the case. Mrs. Caton was initially charged with murder in the second degree, and I believe Mr. Coggin was charged with murder in the first degree. He was represented by Merle Guile, and so I met Mrs. Caton, and she was released on bail. And then about 2 weeks later, she called me, and she had been stopped on North 4th Street by Ray Pickle, who was the sheriff of Garfield County. And Ray said that he had a warrant for first-degree murder. So she was rearrested, brought down to the courthouse, and which at that time the jail was on the 4th floor. And she was denied bail. I believe that may have been on a Friday afternoon. So I wanted to get her bail and decided that to do that, I would file a writ of habeas corpus, which is rarely used, and that may have been, in fact, the first time I used it. I prepared it, and the law on habeas corpus is that you can take it to any judge. It doesn't have to be the judge assigned to the case. In fact, it can be a member of the Supreme Court of Oklahoma, even though they only handle civil matters. I made the strategic decision to take it to Judge George Howard Wilson, who was retired but still was subject to call. I went to Judge Wilson's home, which I believe at that time was on Cherokee, and he received me, and I gave him the petition, and he authorized the filing of it, directed the sheriff to produce her in court. So we had the hearing, as I recall, the following week, maybe Wednesday. Mrs. Kathy Stoker, who I'd originally brought to Enid to work with me, she was then the elected district attorney, and I've forgotten who she's assisted by, but it may have been John Proctor. In any event, we held a day-long habeas corpus hearing, and at the end of it, Judge Wilson called Kathy Stoker to the bench and myself, and he said, "Now, Ms. Stoker, I can't deny bail to this woman based on the evidence that you've given me." And the evidence that Kathy had, which elevated the charge, was there was a woman in the jail named Rosemary Throwbridge. And Rosemary told the sheriff that Mrs. Caton had confessed to her that she had hired Dennis Coggin and that the plan was to murder Mr. Krichmar. I was pretty sure that Mrs. Caton had not told her that, and in any event, they were in separate cells, and there was a brick wall that separated them, so it would have been very difficult for them to communicate. And Mrs. Throwbridge was in jail because she had, as I recall, stolen her mother's jewelry. So she didn't have a significant amount of credibility, but the judge nevertheless granted the order for $100,000 bail, which was posted that afternoon, I believe, by Mrs. Caton's mother-in-law. And Mrs. Caton walked out of the courtroom, I believe, with me, and it was on the picture on the front page of the Enid paper, perhaps with her mother-in-law, Merle Caton's widow. And then I took responsibility for the defense of Mrs. Caton.
Now, a quick question. So you mentioned you'd represented her earlier, but in terms of accepting a case like that, is it because of the relationship you said, I need to do this, or do you kind of do like an internal fact check in terms of your gut on this, or what leads to you accepting a case of this magnitude?
That's a good question.
Well, I'll be frank, Mrs. Caton, her statement to me was, I don't care what it takes or what it costs, I want you to get me off. I said, well, Sue, that's fair enough, except you're guilty of manslaughter. And I can't get you off of manslaughter. I can get you off on murder. She said, why am I guilty of manslaughter? And I said, well, because the evidence is that you had an intermediary and you hired Dennis Coggin, to collect the $12,000. And what Dennis did was, and maybe your suggestion, I don't know, but in any event, he went to a house on, as I recall, off route, and told Mr. Krichmar that he was interested in buying the house. Jack drove to the house and went inside, but Jack was running late, and Dennis had, in the meantime, hidden in the closet. And when Jack came into the room, Dennis had been in the closet for about 30 minutes. It was very hot. The house was unair conditioned. And he had a knife on him, and he stabbed Jack to death. I said, so this is what we call misdemeanor manslaughter. The misdemeanor was to beat him up to collect the debt, and a death occurred during that, which is manslaughter. It's not murder, it's manslaughter. In my opinion, under the circumstances, which were quite interesting and different, the jury will convict you, they'll give you the minimum. And incidentally, Mrs. Caton ended up serving only 8 months at the Pawnee County Jail, where using the Junior Welfare League cookbook, Stirrups, which my wife helped edit.
Major contributor.
She contributed. She did lunch for all the courthouse employees at Pawnee, and the sheriff in return let her come home on Enid on the weekends.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
Well,
I'd say you did well, Brother Jones. You did well. Well, ladies, I'll turn it over to you. That's amazing.
Well, I think it's an interesting question of how an attorney who is not court appointed chooses whether or not to represent someone on a variety of things, whether it's well, in this case, it would be a criminal case, obviously. And I know that you have been court appointed before, and after that, you had done that. When I saw part of the jury, well, I saw all of the prelim, and I reported on it. Some of the things that I don't believe you were admonished for, but that the judge kind of wagged his finger at you a little bit, might have been when you had you brought in your evidence. It was time for you to present Mrs. Caton's evidence, and you came in with, I believe it was a shopping cart, could have been a dolly, But you came in with all of your records into the courtroom, and Miss Stoker objected to that vigorously. And
How tacky of her.
I know. And you unloaded your things and the shopping cart, and Ollie went away. But that was the first time I'd ever seen anything other than on television, something like that, being a humble, newly graduated girl from college going, what just happened? Because this only happens on TV. But it happens in Enid America. Unfortunately, bad things happen here. And then you began your defense. And I don't want to say anything about fashion, but it was the first time I've ever seen a man come in with a white Panama hat into a courtroom. He had a white Panama. I told you I was there. So, and a light suit, and you represented your client. You never raised your voice in making a point, ever. But you were very precise in your questioning, and of those who were answering your questions, you held them to also be very precise to the question. So I remember that very well, where, and I know that Ms. Stoker and you were friends, and I knew that she had worked for you at before then. She had a different role with you at that time. Now you were on the other side of the table. And it drew a lot of interest because, let's face it, they may have had issues in the background that the public did not know. But to the rest of the public, the victim in the case was a clown, a Shriner clown.
Yes.
Jocko the clown.
A very
really?
much a known realtor, a successful realtor. And so it was statewide news. It was just odd enough. The things that he contributed to the community in his role as a Shriner and his role in his business and those things, we did not know about anything in his private life. We knew Jocko the clown, who did things for children at children's hospitals,
Yes.
the Shriners hospitals. So how do you, as an attorney, view the things that the victim has done for the community versus what you may know?
Well, my duty is to defend my client,
Correct.
and the client comes first. And that's who I owe my loyalty to, and that's who I have to exercise it. Because the case did involve prominent people in the community, and because I felt that Kathy perhaps did not know some things that I knew, that I was anxious to avoid scandal and hurt to innocent parties. Mm-hmm. I went over to Kathy's office and informed her. And she first said, well, no, you're mistaken. And I said, I'm not mistaken. And the reason I'm not mistaken is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And she thought a minute, and she said, well, I very much appreciate your telling me that. I said, I don't intend to make any reference to that, and I don't believe any reference was made to it. But nevertheless, it also requires some discretion on the part of the prosecution.
Correct.
If I may, however, there's an aspect of that trial that is not remembered today, but was really the turning point.
Really?
Sounds good.
Which is?
About 2 weeks after Mrs. Caton was elected on bail, or released on bail, she called me and said she had been served a summons. I said, a summons? You mean a subpoena? And she said, no, a summons. And I said, for what? And she said, well, apparently Mr. Krichmar's widow has sued me for wrongful death.
That's right.
And I said, you're
She
kidding
did.
me.
That was part of the deal.
I forgot.
And I said, bring that down to my office immediately. So she brought it down to my office, and sure enough, there it was, a very able lawyer, I think it was Jim Follier in Oklahoma City, had filed this wrongful death action against Mrs. Caton, and perhaps Caton Lumber, I can't remember. So I said, well, this is the best news, and Mrs. Caton said, why or how? I said, because we can take depositions. At that time, the police department had not told me anything. This was very unusual. Usually, police officers and defense attorneys will often work together to a limited extent, or at least they will give you the courtesy of telling what the case is about. Kathy Stoker had put the gag order on all of them. I mean, they didn't utter a word. So I immediately prepared a countersuit against Mr. Krichmar's estate for the $12,000, and that's why I remember it was 12, so that they couldn't dismiss that civil suit once they discovered what I was going to do with it. So as soon as that civil suit was filed and I filed my countersuit, which kept it from being dismissed on the plaintiff's motion, I issued subpoenas for all the police officers and everyone I could think of to appear in Stephen Jones's 11th floor conference room to give a deposition in the case of State of Jack Krichmar versus Sue Caton. Well, that created, as you can imagine, concern with the police and the district attorney. They could have stopped, at least there was case law that permitted the stopping of my civil case, but they didn't seek to stop it. Instead, I offered that a representative of the district attorney's office could be present. So John Proctor was present at all times when the depositions were taken. Now, to the point of interest. I scheduled one deposition immediately after lunch on a nice, as I recall, springtime afternoon when I was pretty sure that a lot of people would be dozing off. And I scheduled Rosemary Throwbridge, the woman that was allegedly going to prove Mrs. Caton had confessed. So about the 10th or 11th question I asked Mrs. Throwbridge what her family consisted of. She said, well, I'm divorced and I had a child named Desiree who is deceased and she died. And I said, where were you living when this occurred? And she gave me an address, which I don't remember, but it was in Houston, Texas, where I had grown up. And let's just say the address is 12345 East Broadway. I said, what were the circumstances of your daughter's death? She said, well, she was attacked by a German Shepherd owned by a man named, and I've forgotten his last name, but let's just say John Doe. And she died as a result of this attack. And then I asked her the key question. I said, what funeral home handles your daughter's service? And she said, I don't know. Ben Taub Hospital made all those arrangements. Well, I'd worked at funeral homes. I knew that wasn't true. So I said, well, let's take a 5-minute break. So I went into my, what we call Lexus room, and I quickly typed in German Shepherd death, name of the child, Desiree, came up blank. So I went back and I said, Ms. Throwbridge, where was your child born? Oh, she was born with a midwife. And I said, and do you remember where your child is buried? Yes. No one objects to any of these questions, which totally unrelated to the case. Said Forest Park Cemetery in Houston. I said, and Mr. Grigsby, I think actually was the man's name. Where did he work? Larry Grigsby. Well, he worked for the Houston Post. And when was this? And she told me. And how old was your daughter? 5 years old. I said, all right. And then I asked her some other questions. And as soon as the deposition was over, I called Marty Reed, who was a private investigator I used. And I said, Marty, I want you and Chuck to get down to Houston right away, and I want you to interview this German Shepherd. I want you to get an affidavit from him. And gave him all the details. And he and Chuck went down to Houston, and about 3 days later, he called me at my home at night. And he said, Stephen, this is Marty, Chuck, and I are reporting in. I said, what do you find? He said, well, first of all, no Larry Grigsby works for the Houston Post, and we checked the Houston Chronicle and the Houston Press. I said, okay. We can't find anything in the newspaper about this attack. There's no death certificate for Rosemary Throwbridge, and Desiree. Yeah. And furthermore, there's no birth certificate for her. And we went to Forest Park Cemetery, and she is not a resident in any of the Houston facilities Forest Park Cemetery, and they check their worldwide directory, and she's not a resident permanently at any of the other facilities. I said, well, what you're telling me is that I sent you down to Houston on a very simple assignment, and you've not been able to accomplish any of the things that I asked you to do. He said, well, it does appear that way, but Chuck had an idea. I said, oh, Chuck, well, let's hear Chuck's idea. Well, Chuck suggested we go down to the Hall of Records and run Rosemary Throwbridge's name. I said, good old Chuck. So did you do that? Yes, and what'd you find? Well, what we found was that Rosemary was married. And I said, well, really? Yes, to a Houston police detective on the Vice Squad.
Wow.
I said, well, did you and Chuck amble over to the police station and interview him? We sure did. And what did he say? And it was not complimentary, and this is a family broadcast, so I won't repeat what the ex-husband said.
God bless you,
But
Senator.
basically, he allowed that one time she lived, I think, in Springfield, Missouri, and it told the FBI she'd been kidnapped by the Ku Klux Klan and held for several days until they released her, all of which was a fraud. So at the end of it, I said, Marty, what we have here, you're telling me as a result of this, is you have a second immaculate conception in which a child is born and in the period of 3 months grows to the age of 5, dies, and bodily ascends into heaven.
It's a miracle.
It's a miracle. And he said, that's when he said, well, that's one explanation, but Chuck's got another one.
It's probably another.
So
Oh, my.
I will tell you at the preliminary hearing. Oh, and the other thing he said, now, Steve, one other thing. This 12345 East Broadway? I said, yes. He said, well, that's two things. Could be one of two things. It could be an address in Pasadena and an address in Houston. I said, well, what's at the one in Houston? He said, well, that's the north-south runway at Will Hobby Airport. And I said, well, what's at the address in Pasadena? He said, tank number 35 of the Texaco refinery. I said,
Wow.
well, Marty, you barely saved your job. So at the preliminary hearing, and I didn't tell Kathy I had any of this. So when Kathy called Rosemary Throwbridge, I handed her 2 photographs. And I said, do you recognize these photographs? And she said, no. Kathy objected, said, well, I think Mr. Jones ought to tell us what they are. And I said, well, this is the address, but you said you lived in Houston. And one of them looks to me like a tank at a refinery, and the other looks like an airport runway.
My.
Kathy started to object. I believe Bill Blue was the magistrate. He wanted to know where I was going, and I said, well, I will inform the court, but I asked the witness to be excused and go beyond the court's hearing. So he agreed, and I made what we had found, and the room was about 200 people. And when Rosemary Throwbridge came back in the room, everyone knew she was a liar except herself. Well, she knew she was a liar, but she didn't know I knew. So no one left the courtroom, and it took about 5 minutes to make the offer of proof. She did not testify at trial. Kathy struck her name from the list. That happens very rarely, and that was a fortunate break for the defense.
So it was the nullification of a jailhouse confession.
Yes, which
Right.
I didn't believe.
Right. But you were able to prove that it wasn't
Right.
true.
Well, I don't know that I proved it wasn't true. I proved Rosemary Throwbridge was a liar.
Wasn't credible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just to go back slightly, so the district attorney's rep, when you were doing the depositions, if they'd been more in their game, could they have jumped in and kind of sidetracked that, or did you have complete power in a deposition to ask all the questions? Because that seems to me like they missed a golden opportunity to maybe get a timeout.
Well, I don't want to be critical of anyone. I don't think they could have. I think by then it was too late.
Okay.
Had they petitioned the court to delay depositions until the conclusion of the criminal case, I'm not sure that the judge would have granted that, but there is a chance he would have granted because the case law goes both ways. But they did not do that. The other thing that that helped the defense was we had to make the decision of whether to put Mrs. Caton on the stand. And I had a number of character witnesses, and I had the first trial I'd ever had a jury consultant. I had Larry Reitzman,
Interesting.
who was a professor of social psychology at University of Kansas. Larry was a very gifted man, and that's the first time, as I said, I'd used a jury consultant. And he explained to me the facts of life of picking a jury, and he was right. And so I used his
criteria.
guide in his criteria, and we ended up with a jury. April is right, the case was moved. In fact, the state didn't even object to the case being moved to Kay County. And incidentally, Kay County retaliated by the next year they moved one of their cases to Garfield.
Garfield County.
That's a little bit of our money.
The case was tried in the Ponca City courthouse. The courthouse is actually in Newkirk, but because they held trials in Ponca City, then the council chambers was effectively the courthouse in Ponca City. Judge Richard Pickens here was the judge. He was very fair to both sides. That's how the trial progressed. But in any event, we had told the jury that Mrs. Caton would testify. And that was our plan. And Larry said, don't tell the jury that unless you do it.
Okay.
Well, now I had decided after I listened to the tape recording that Sue gave Carol Guffey, who was the chief detective. I thought, well, there's nothing that Sue can say that improves on this tape recording. So why expose Sue to cross-examination? I just won't object to the state using Carol Guffey's tape recording. So basically, Sue testified during the state's portion when they played Carol Guffey's interview.
It didn't have to undergo
And I
cross-examination.
didn't have to do it. Now,
Okay.
that explains, though, what we had to do with the jury. So I asked all the expert witnesses, or not experts, character witnesses, of which there were about 7. They were in the courtroom. They had their suits on, dresses, and I stood up. I said, Your Honor, we are not going to call Mrs. Caton, and with the court's permission, I'd like to ask the character witnesses to excuse themselves. The jurors turned around and saw probably half a dozen to a dozen well-dressed men and women, which added to the credibility of Mrs. Caton. And they were excused, and the jury, as I said, found her guilty of manslaughter. Mr. Coggin was found guilty, April is right, of murder, and he was sentenced to life, but he was tried in Oklahoma County.
And he was tried in Oklahoma City.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so let me ask you this, because it would have been my first criminal trial that I would have covered,
But not your last.
but not my last.
Okay, the only thing I want to interject, going up to Ponca City, did Alan Page pay you mileage?
I didn't actually get to go to
Oh, you
the
didn't?
actual
Okay.
trial. They sent another person who worked at the radio station
Okay.
to that portion of it.
Just curious.
No, he probably wouldn't have paid me mileage, but I did love
God
Alan
love
Page,
radio.
and he's a Hall
And he
of
was a
Fame radio
good
person,
guy. Good guy.
great
I loved
guy,
him.
just like a dad to me. But so when you're preparing a case such as this with someone who in the public was much beloved, and you have a triangle or whatever you have going on here, you have Mr. Coggin who's tried first, or at
Yes,
least
he was tried first.
tried first, clear, no worries there because it's pretty cut and cleared of what happened on that end. How many people from your office help you in preparing such a case that had drawn such statewide attention?
All of them.
How many were there then?
At least half a dozen, if not more.
All attorneys?
No. I think maybe Rob Nye was with me.
Okay.
And Rob did a major portion of the defense preparation. I can't remember any others at the time, possibly Craig Bryant. This was 1984. Tom Blakely. Alec McNaughton may have been with me at the time. In fact, Alec was with me, as was Susan. So they helped.
So quite a bit of information. How do you insulate your client? How did you insulate Karen Sue Caton from the
Media
for the media
Because it
attention?
was a frenzy back
It
then. I remember
was.
it was such a big
How do you
case, and people
protect your
were
client?
jostling to get information.
Well, I also had to protect myself. I mean, I think
Correct.
that case was as difficult for me personally and professionally as the representation of Tim McVeigh and Enid. There were a lot of dead flowers delivered to our house. Mr. Krichmar and his family were well known in the community, and we had mutual friends that knew them, particularly friends of Cheryl that knew friends of Ms. Krichmar. It was a difficult time, although I don't think Judy Krichmar was anything other than a class act. I mean, obviously this was significant loss to her,
Yes.
and we respected that. And so we concentrated on that this was not a murder case. This was, in fact, indirectly, we put the blame on Wendy Barker, who was the state's key witness, and Dennis Coggin.
And Wendy Barker was held in the Garfield County Jail throughout the whole period from the time that she was identified as a witness until the end.
I can't remember that. That wouldn't surprise me. A key to, I think, the successful defense, and I have to give credit to Rob Nye for this, because he did the legwork, and Rob is deceased, and he was, I asked him to be my deputy in the defense of Mr. McVeigh, so we were fairly close. Wendy Barker had made probably 12 statements, tape recorded, written about the death and her relationship with Mrs. Caton and Mr. Krichmar. And Rob and I painlessly went through I think I had 12 categories. What did Wendy Barker say about this, 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 and this? And then her 12 different versions. And I remember, and that was devastating to the state's case, in my opinion. And I remember telling the jury in closing argument, now that you know what you know about Wendy Barker, if today after trial you were driving down the street or the highway and you saw Wendy Barker trying to hitchhike a ride, you would not stop and pick her up. You would not hire her. You would not let her be your babysitter. You would not sell anything to her. You would not rent anything. You would not associate yourself with her. But yet Mrs. Stoker wants you to accept her word and send my client to the prison. And I think that probably was the most effective point.
She did seem to struggle on stand.
Now, who is, okay, so
Because we
remind
just
me who
introduced
Wendy Barker was.
in the last few minutes. So.
Wendy was also a person of interest to the police department as a result of a death on Broadway, right across Van Buren. She wasn't charged, but that woman also had a will, and I've forgotten now how we found this out, but Wendy had checked out some books, as I recall, from the Enid Public Library on wills. And maybe somebody at the library, Jean Harrington may have told me that. She was the librarian at the time. But in any event, we were able to confirm that. So, but in all fairness to Kathy Stoker, Kathy is now married to Rick West, who later became chief of police. Well, at the time of this, Rick was a detective, and Rick was an excellent detective. And right after Wendy Barker had made this tape-recorded alleged confession about Sue and Dennis and all that, Carol Guffey left the tape recording on. And Carol was a very professional police officer. And Rick, who was a young man, probably 30, comes in, and Carol, and it's on the tape, he says, "Rick, come over here. I want to hear you. I want you to hear what Wendy says." So, and the tape is still running. I mean, he's listening to a tape, and his reaction is being taped.
Right.
And when he finishes, Carol said, "What do you think?" And Rick says, "You want to know what Stephen Jones is going to do with that? He's going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5." And I had on a sheet of paper I'd already written down.
Yes, he gave you notes.
And they were the same as Rick. I later told Rick that. I said, you
summed it up pretty good.
You summed it, yeah, he did. I always think it was ironic that then he and Kathy were married. But the Enid Police Department at that time had some very competent, capable, and professional detectives and officers, and they may have today. I'm not meaning by that to criticize today, but at that time, it was a challenging case because they were challenging, and yet we all knew each other. But it was a circulation builder for the Enid Morning News. Let me tell you.
Well, we certainly needed that, I'm sure.
That started, as I said, in May, and I mean every day. And I've forgotten the name of the reporter. It's a young woman.
Jerry.
Was that it?
It was Jerry Ayers.
Okay.
And she would always describe what Karen Sue was wearing in court.
She did do that.
Yeah.
Yes, she did.
But it was a circulation builder, and
It was huge.
I owe much to the Garbers, and I had the privilege of representing them at the newspaper for, as you know, the newspaper then was owned by the Garbers and the Taylors, and I represented the Garber side for a while. And but they knew a circulation builder when they saw one.
And let me say, Jerry and I were new. Both of us knew at reporting at the time. And she went on to be a great teacher and a great friend of mine later on in life. And so she was really, really good. One of the things that you said, though, that interests me, always interests me, but is interesting from this perspective, since we're talking to you as the defense attorney in a case, is that you liken the public outcry against yourself and your client to that of Timothy McVeigh. So as a defense attorney, and speaking for yourself and other defense attorneys out there, or someone who's thinking about becoming a defense attorney, how does this happen often, or is it depending on the circumstances?
Well, first of all, we don't need any more criminal defense lawyers in Oklahoma. Arkansas, maybe, Kansas, Louisiana, but not in Oklahoma.
Okay,
we're really
we've maxed out.
Got a lot.
We're maxed out.
Okay, so no more.
That's right, no more. It doesn't happen very often. And it's a natural reaction for some people, and it's part of your responsibility and part of the challenge. And if you're serious about it, about your work, you have to understand that in rare cases, advocacy can lead to death. And you can't worry about that. You can worry about the effect on your family. But if you're committed to the representation of your client, then you have to and should, that's what the lawyer's oath requires, in the same way that a physician may operate to save a man that has committed multiple murders. And that's not for all lawyers, and I understand that. They don't want to do that, but I don't want to read abstracts either. So
Right.
So, in a case like that, and the case is over, there's been some hard feelings. Do relationships get repaired, or does it take time? Or, how do you handle that, being a big name in the community yourself?
Relationships with who?
With the people that maybe have been upset with you for taking the case.
Well, my model as a lawyer, even then and certainly today, was Harold Singer. I thought Harold Singer was the greatest trial lawyer that I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of trial lawyers in a lot of different places. And I think I tried to emulate myself after Harold. And in fact, when Harold died, I hired his secretary so she could sit down and tell me Harold's approach for things that I did not know or realize. And I benefited from that. I think answer to your question is the same way that Harold did it. You just don't get emotional. You have to understand people don't seek at things the way you see them. They don't know what you know. And so therefore you just kind of give them a general amnesty and go on rather than trying to debate the point with them, because you're trying to approach it intellectually and they're approaching it emotionally.
Gotcha.
And so it's just best to avoid that confrontation, and I've not had any problem with that. I do remember one time I was outside Walcomas going to some place there, and some man came up and asked me if I'd represented Abby Hoffman, and I said yes. He said, well, I'll just knock the what, out of you. And I said, well, you need to get in line.
Take a number.
I walked off. So, and that's probably the closest. And I had a couple of people in the bombing case, and that came up to me, and I would say, our conversation, there are television cameras, and it will not help your cause to be seen as doing anything that you later regret. So I'm going to leave. I'm going to walk away, and thank you for sharing your views with me. And then you just walk away.
Well, I could go ahead.
One thing before we kind of wrap up here, and I so appreciate everybody
very
being involved.
Very interesting.
But the thing I'd like to go back and discuss, because being from Enid in that time, in regards to this case, there were so many absolutely horrid and ugly rumors about everything, and I think it's just so amazing that you and Kathy sat down and kind of decided that rather than go down all of those avenues which have been so hurtful and just so painful, to set that aside, because in this day and age it seems like that's unavoidable.
No.
So I thought that was kind of like old school class.
Well, this district, since 1970, has only had 3 district attorneys, Earl Gerke, Kathy Stoker, and Mike Fields, and all 3 of them have been very professional, very cordial. I've never had an issue with any of them, and I'm not trying to gild the lily, because there's certainly many district attorneys that don't follow that path, but they do. I mean, that's been true of each one of them. And so anytime there's a case here in Garfield County, to me, that's an advantage, because I'm dealing with professionals.
And I think that's true. I think I will say that as I started my career in reporting, the 80s Enid was not an easy town to live in. It was violent. It was a violent era of our community. There were a lot of court trials, unfortunately. There were a lot of deaths in the 80s here, and heinous crimes. And I will say that our district court and those who were representing everyone, depending on which side they were on, doesn't matter, did work very hard to not continue to victimize the victims and ancillary victims in those cases, because there's the victim, and then there's the victims in each case. So I think that Garfield County does get it right. I think that in the case of Dennis Coggin, he had a very competent attorney who was assigned a case that was
Unwinnable.
Probably, I don't know.
But he did save him from the death penalty.
He did a great job.
Yeah.
He did a great job because he had someone who had no reputation, but he did a good job on his end. He probably didn't get death threats because it was kind of over and done.
Yeah.
And then this other started, and so.
Right.
It was an interesting decade, and you played a big part. Unfortunately, and fortunately, I suppose it's a two-edged sword for you and for everyone involved. But you're a big part of the history of Enid, and what happens on the criminal side and on the civil side as well. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. Not now, but they should.
Well, I just tell people that Cindy and April put me up to it. And then I get sympathy.
Next time I'll tell you the time ABC News interviewed me about Stephen Jones.
So, Cindy, before we go, you kind of got to see this from a 1,000-foot view because you weren't here when this occurred.
Right.
Your thoughts? Because I know you did research on the actual
I did a little bit of
news,
research, on the news coverage and everything else, and it seems pretty much like a kind of a not as I know it was big news at the time, but compared to what happens in some court cases today that we are all exposed to, it seems like it was a very good and professional process that I think it sounds like Garfield County can be proud of.
Yeah, I agree. Any final thoughts from you, my dear?
Not unless you want to hear about the time ABC interviewed me about Stephen Jones.
We'll save that for the next one.
Tee that one up.
Keep listening and watching Enid Buzz. Brother Jones, any final thoughts from you? We really appreciate you doing this, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me as a guest and allowing me to share this story with you and April and Cindy.
We appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, I'm Frank Baker for Enid Buzz. This may also pop up on the News and Eagle. So anyway, and thanks to Justin Blazer from Blazer Pro, who has got like a 3-camera shoot and is going to make us all look and sound lovelier than we probably already are. All right. Thank you, brother. Thanks for watching or listening.
Wow. What'd you think?
Man, that's cool. I hadn't seen the video, hadn't heard the podcast, obviously, because, we're going to surprise everybody.
Yeah. And I don't really remember the case that much. I think I was off
your school.
I think I was off at school
Yeah,
so it was cool listening to Stephen Jones and April and getting to hear all of the details behind that. Very cool.
No, I remember it very well. It was a big deal. It was sad, actually.
Yeah.
And he was a really nice guy.
Yeah.
I remember everybody's like, "What? No way." Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, we hope you guys did enjoy that. That was very cool having Stephen Jones on the BuzzHead Radio Podcast.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
You never know. We could have him on a future one. Or if you guys really enjoyed this kind of a crime version, what we might do is bring like maybe every 2 or 3 months, do it again. We'll find another case from the history of Enid. And they may not all be murders. They might be some other crime or some other great story. Maybe Cindy at the Enid News and Eagle can come up with some of the bigger stories from Enid's past, and we'll try to find somebody in town that was either connected to it or knows about it, and we'll interview them and maybe do some more of those podcasts. So
we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. So not a whole lot of Enid news. Go to enidbuzz.com and look at the calendar or the blog if you want to know what's coming up. You can call us at 580-541-3805 if you have some. If you want us to do an episode on a story from Enid's past, let us know, because there are some really cool stories. And you can email us at buzz@buzzheadmedia.com. So again, thank Enid Auto Body for being our corporate sponsor of the show, and I think we're gonna get out of here.
See you later.
See ya. Hey, Buzzheads, welcome to
BuzzHead Radio.
BuzzHead Radio.